Of our Lunch and Learn. It is Pennsylvania Healthy Lands Week. I am your host, Amy Hill, and we have a special conversation today with author and conservation historian Allen Dieterich-Ward. Pennsylvania Healthy Lands Week is a time set aside for us to reflect and appreciate the stewardship that we must accept responsibility for maintaining and keeping our public lands and our cultural and natural resources, making them available for everyone to enjoy for generations to come. Today, we'll be speaking with Allen, and he's going to talk a little bit about his recent book, little show and tell here, his book called The Cradle of Conservation. Pennsylvania has been a significant player, has played a pivotal role in the history of conservation, and our understanding of what our responsibilities are toward conservation today has its roots here with some Pennsylvania leaders. So Allen, I'm going to leave it up to you to sort of talk to us a little bit. Tell us what that was all about.
Thanks, Pam. Excuse me. Thanks, Amy. I was just thinking of Pam because Pam's going to stick our slides up here in just a second. Thanks, Amy. It is truly an honor to be here on the kickoff of Healthy Lands Week. I'm super excited. Pennsylvania does indeed have a fascinating and absolutely vital role in the history of conservation and the environmental movement, and now the environmental justice movement. Not just kind of here in our region, but nationally and throughout the world. So it's, I think, fitting for us as we get ready to celebrate healthy lands and all that brings with us to look back at the past and think a little bit about how we got here, which also then gives us the opportunity to think about what the future might hold for the living landscapes of Pennsylvania. Pam, if you go ahead and pull my slides up now. There we are. So I'm going to take just a couple minutes and give you a quick breeze through of some of the key ideas from the book and of Pennsylvania conservation history more generally. Then I'm really looking forward to having a chat with Amy and anyone who wants to participate for the latter half of our discussion. So this is, if you don't know who it is, this is Joseph Rothrock, known as the father of Pennsylvania forestry. He's actually standing there on what's later called Pulpit Rock here in Franklin County, the same county where I'm actually sitting here where I live. And Rothrock's sort of status in Pennsylvania and nationally as this leader of Pennsylvania's conservation history and of being the father of Pennsylvania's forests is really one of the starting points for my book, kind of thinking carefully about who were the people that really drove the conversation around conservation among environmentalism and with environmental justice here in Pennsylvania. The other key idea, and again, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to give a real breeze through over the book. Hold on one second. To give a breeze through over the book. And that other key idea here are working landscapes. So here in Pennsylvania, every inch of ground that you might cover has been worked and has been engaged with human beings for thousands of years. And the the layers of human involvement with the landscape have created this really fascinating, multifaceted landscape that we have today. And so this notion of a working landscape, an environment that is not somehow distant, somehow far away, sort of outside of human experience, but is in fact intimately tied to human history, is really this other starting point for the book. And what I want you to do is to just take 1 second and just think through the working landscapes of your life, right? Whether that is, in the case of me, looking out my office window at the neighborhood park across the street, that I know was funded by Project 70 funds raised by bond issue, across the state of Pennsylvania. Whether that is the office park where you're sitting, whether that is the interstate highway that you drove on to get to wherever you are right now, whether that's that favorite wild place out in Pennsylvania's many amazing state parks and forests, or whether it's an industrial landscape like we see here up in northeastern Pennsylvania. Think carefully about all of the different aspects of human history that have combined with the natural history of that landscape to create that particular place that we have today. And think about the ways in which we not only think about the physical landscape, but also about that landscape of the mind. What is it that we treasure about those landscapes? And how do those landscapes help us to understand ourselves as Pennsylvanians of today? All of those things put together really combine to help us to understand Pennsylvania's conservation and environmental history every bit as much as the individual people do. So my book is structured around 5 different chapters, all of which talk about these working landscapes just as much as they talk about the people like Joseph Rothrock, who helped to kind of drive the conservation of those landscapes over time. Okay. So we start out in thinking about the native peoples of Pennsylvania, the agricultural revolution, kind of the origins of civilization, of culture here in Pennsylvania. And I think one of the most important things that we can think about there is the way in which the physical landscape of Pennsylvania helped to create and shape the lived experiences of both native peoples and of Europeans as they encountered these landscapes. They often had to leave behind some of the preconceptions, the notions that they had of how to farm, right? Of how to produce goods, of how to live. Many of those things they brought with them, but others got left behind as they encountered this entirely new landscape, right? So we can think about the ways in which both the physical space of Pennsylvania and the cultural values that native peoples and of Europeans brought with them to help shape this new landscape. And of course, these early landscapes, the big changes that we see to them over time, whether that is the use of fire, the use of agriculture among native peoples, whether that is the development of a market economy as early European settlers look to harvest the goods of this new world to them and ship them back to Europe. We can think about the ways in which these different cultural values shaped the natural landscape, and in turn, how that natural landscape shaped those values. Of course, when we think of Pennsylvania and we think of working landscapes, the Industrial Revolution, the steel mills of Johnstown or of Pittsburgh, the coal mines, of northeastern Pennsylvania's anthracite, or the bituminous coal mines in the rest of southern and western Pennsylvania, we think of the ways in which these working landscapes are sort of dramatically altered during the course of the 19th century as industry, technology, and especially transportation changes with first canals and turnpikes, later on the railroads, decrease the amount of time it took to get from one place to another, allowing for this sort of massive industrialization and all of the consequences that came with it, of course. And of course, those are social consequences as well as natural consequences. When we think of the natural resources of Pennsylvania, the harvesting, the integration of those resources in these big mills, these mines, these railroads, we think also of the social and cultural changes that happen, the shift from farms and agriculture into coal mine camps, into steel towns, and into the development and growth of cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And of course, those cities too had their own working landscapes. Just because you pave over the ground, just because you build a skyscraper, right, does not mean that nature somehow goes away. Of course not, right? And the lived environments, the working landscapes that people had and experienced in those cities really came to drive the next phase of Pennsylvania's environmental history. And that, of course, is the development of the conservation movement, right? We kind of often tend to think of the conservation movement as something that's happening out in the woods, you know, the creation of state forests, right? It's all about trees. Of course not. It's not about trees, or it's not just about trees. It's about the political relationships. It's about the alliances. It's about the landscapes of the mind that draw people together to then go and protect those landscapes. Remember the origins of the Pennsylvania Forestry Association, which came to be the most important forestry association in the United States of America. It defined and created this legacy of state forests that we have in Pennsylvania. It was not created somewhere out in Franklin County or a remote part of the state. It was created right in the heart of Old Town Philadelphia by some of the wealthiest and most politically connected Pennsylvanians that there were, right? So in order to get political movement, you have to have resources. You have to have politically connected people. And so it was actually the residents of Philadelphia and of Harrisburg, as well as smaller towns, who really launched the conservation movement in Pennsylvania. Now, and you can see some of them here in this picture. Joseph Rothrock is there sitting at the table. This is the first class of those conservationists who came at the origins of professional forestry. But let me just draw your attention very quickly to two particular people in that room that may stand out to you a little bit, right? Of all of these men, and of course, white men in particular, there are two people that stand out who were there at the beginning of forestry in Pennsylvania. One of them sitting down is Myra Lloyd Dock. If Joseph Rothrock was the father of Pennsylvania forestry, then surely Myra Lloyd Dock was its mother. She was a trained botanist, trained at the University of Michigan, where I went, of course, who brought her skills back to her hometown of Harrisburg at a time when women found it very difficult to be in scientific fields. She became a much sought-after lecturer and parlayed that influence into a very important movement for urban renewal in Harrisburg called City Beautiful in Harrisburg, as well as becoming the very first woman to hold any elected or public office in the state of Pennsylvania. And she became the very first woman in the world to serve on a forestry commission when she was appointed to the new Pennsylvania Forest Commission. Now, standing right behind her is Ralph Brock. Ralph Brock was from Westchester, Pennsylvania. He was a protege of Rothrock's, who was one of the very first class of trained foresters at the new Mont Alto, Pennsylvania Forest Academy in Mont Alto. Ralph Brock was the very first professionally trained African-American forester in the world. So here at the origins of professional forestry, of conservation, this cradle of conservation, right? We have both women and people of color. Hidden, untold stories, or stories not told as often as they should. In order to understand Pennsylvania's conservation and environmental history, you have to understand the history of the people who made that. And here we have Myra Lloyd Dock and Ralph Brock at its very origins. Okay, so the conservation movement, which resulted in enormous changes to the natural world in Pennsylvania, was followed in the post-World War II movement, post-World War II period, by the environmental movement. And Amy and I are going to talk a little bit more about conservation and environmentalism later on when we have our chat. But I just want to draw your attention as we think about Pennsylvania's role in the environmental movement to this landscape here, the landscape of the suburbs, right? The landscape of folks who are looking for that natural world, that leafy green suburb, but all too often are faced with polluted landscapes, overflowing septic tanks, undrinkable water, air pollution. It is really here in these suburbs of Pennsylvania where you see the push for the environmental movement that emerges. Of course, in the late 1960s and 1970s, you have this absolute flurry of activity around environmentalism, around the environmental cause. Much of it motivated in part by other Pennsylvanians like Rachel Carson, right, who begin to understand the natural world as something that is ecological, in which all of these different elements are connected to one another and need to be protected as part of this lived landscape, this working landscape of integrated components. Now, I'm going to wrap things up because I want to leave as much time as possible for our chat, but I want to draw your attention, of course, to the last 30 years as well. What we can think of as post-industrial Pennsylvania. And this has been this absolutely fascinating time to study Pennsylvania's environmental history, where on the one hand, you have amazing environmental improvements brought about in large part by those new environmental regulations that were passed in the 1960s and 70s, especially. You have the rewilding of species in Pennsylvania, like the bald eagle, that were either extinct or nearly extinct. When I go out into the Michaud State Forest, near me, I regularly see bald eagles now. I regularly see foxes. I regularly see the impact of bobcats. Something that simply would not have existed 50 years ago, and something that we can thank the environmental movement for. On the other hand, the changes in Pennsylvania's industrial economy have meant all kinds of different shifts in the focus of environmentalism, of conservation, and of this movement we call environmental justice, in which we ask, who are those people who are left out of environmental improvements, and what kind of equity should we have in our policies to ensure that they are included as well, particularly in areas that have been so hard hit by our changing economy, our shift from factories to service sector, or the automation of jobs that were formerly done by human beings. So we have this really sort of important contemporary set of questions about what should environmental policy be and who should benefit from those policies, and how should they benefit. And that brings us, I think, to the present day, in which particularly, I think, some of the changes and some of the global phenomena of the last year, I point particularly to the COVID-19 epidemic, in which folks were sort of encouraged to do things outside to avoid spreading disease. Traveling was limited, as you all know, and this really became a period where a lot of folks rediscovered or discovered for the very first time the working landscapes around them and fell in love with them all over again. I am really active with my local rail trail group, and we saw usage of that rail trail absolutely take off in 2020, and those numbers have stayed very, very high. So we have to think then, what do we all need to do as Pennsylvanians to ensure that the legacy of being that cradle of conservation is going to be there for the generations that come after us? So there's a little sort of teaser of the book, and I think Amy's going to post, if you'd like to have a copy, how to go about doing that somewhere on the chat. And I'm looking forward to our conversation, Amy.
Yes, thank you so much, Alan. And I myself have read the book. I found it very enlightening and sort of almost what you just said, that call, like, what can I do? What can all of us do to carry on that legacy? Special thanks to the Pennsylvania Parks and Forests Foundation for hosting this live virtual event today. And you can see the link on your screen right there. You can buy the book from PPFF and, enjoy it yourself. I think there's probably some other events planned where you can have these conversations with Alan about the book and about what he's
Right.
learned.
Into a neighborhood near you. That's right.
Yes. I would like to say, though, just to sort of carry on this conversation a little bit more, I, for one, I live in the city of Harrisburg, and I see every time I leave my house that legacy of Mira Lloyd Dock and her City Beautiful movement. The city's infrastructure is built around access to open space and conservation. But what exactly do we mean when we're talking about conservation and environmental justice? In your book, what are you talking about with those concepts?
So I kind of view these in terms of generations, generational need, generational desire. You know, the same, I think, impulses always affect humanity, right? How do we go about creating a world that is better, right? That is better for ourselves, better for those who are coming next. Those impulses are always there. But based upon the context of the time period, they can manifest themselves in slightly different, in slightly different ideologies. And that's really the case here if we're thinking about the desire to protect with, to engage with those things that we love in the world around us. And we can divide this up kind of into three different eras. And these are three different ideologies, but they're really about kind of generational shifts and what is important and what is valued within that broader context. So the first kind of movement for protection of the world, of the natural world that we see, is the conservation movement. And Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief of the National Forest Service, as it's created in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, founder of founds the Yale Forestry School, helps found Montalto Forestry School, becomes Pennsylvania governor twice. Pinchot described the conservation as seeking to ensure the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time, right? And what that element does is takes this kind of older philosophy of what we call utilitarianism, right? The great, Spock famously said this, in Star Trek, when do the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? But what Pinchot does is says we need to also add the element of time to this, right? How do we go about protecting and using resources, not just for what matters to us today, but also looking to multiple generations down the line, right? And so the protection of our forests, which is kind of this first phase of conservation, really became about how do we go about understanding that these forests are a finite resource, and that if they are left to only serving the needs of today, right, that can then destroy this resource for subsequent generations, right? So conservation is the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. Now, the environmental movement takes that principle, right, but it adds in an element of, and Rachel Carson really sort of popularized this notion of ecology. That is that human beings are not simply separate from the world around them, but that the greatest good for human beings also needs, in the long run, to encompass the natural dynamics, the natural world, the web of life, right, in order to get spiritual, if you like. And that essentially there needs to be this extra layer that the greatest good for the greatest number needs to also not just be about human beings, but to also be about the natural world itself, right? Plants, animals, and that serving those needs, again, still serves human needs, but it also extends that web in a more sophisticated way, in a way that conservation doesn't. Now, here's the trick. Here's the interesting part, I think. Environmental justice, right? Environmental justice actually looks, when we talk about the greatest good for the largest number, what happens when some people, not the greatest number, but a minority, right, themselves are asked generation after generation after generation to exist in a less than ideal environment to make things better for other people, right? And so, in essence, the environmental justice movement says, right, What about when the needs of the few actually are greater than the needs of others? Those who are left out of good environments to live in, those that are sacrificed for others. How do we go about ensuring that those who are asked generation after generation because of poverty, because of minority status, right? How do we go about ensuring that they too will have access to a good environment, even if that can sometimes mean that other people are going to be expected to have less ideal circumstances so that everyone can benefit from from a good and clean environment, right? And so that's really the stage where you can see how that progression is. It begins with the same set of ideas, the same set of goals, but depending on kind of the time period, the context, it reshapes them a bit for the context in which it happens.
For sure. Well, so many good lessons to be learned by studying our history and reflecting what it looks like today. What I gathered from the book was that passion and courage were sort of the critical components to standing up and making a change in the world around us. And we have some giants of history who lived here and fought for what we call home here in Pennsylvania. So excellent.
And we live with the legacy. We're living with their legacy every day. That's right.
We live with their legacy every day. And part of Pennsylvania Healthy Lands Week is to do exactly this, is to ask ourselves these questions of what is happening in the world around us? What can I do to be a good steward of these resources? I think none of us can take for granted that we're going to have clean air, good drinking water, healthy environment, and beautiful landscapes that we cannot really ever stand down without paying attention to.
We all have to take responsibility. We all have to take responsibility. That's right.
For sure. So there are many different events going on across the Commonwealth during this week for Pennsylvania Healthy Lands Week. If you visit our website, Pam, you can throw up the website on the screen there. There are all kinds of opportunities. Some of the opportunities are.
Today, I mentioned earlier in the talk that one of my that I'm involved with the local Cumberland Valley Rails to Trails Council. Well, we are celebrating our 20th year of the Cumberland Valley Rail Trail, our 20th anniversary. As part of Healthy Lands Week, we're going to have a 2-day celebration this Friday and Saturday, including Cumberland Valley Trail Fest here in Shippensburg. So I am, in addition to my event today, boy, oh boy, I am super excited about everything that we have planned throughout Pennsylvania to celebrate our healthy lands.
Yeah, so many good opportunities. There are opportunities to appreciate the world around us. I'm going to be participating in the Trail Fest myself, but there are also some opportunities to gain some education, to learn a thing or two. And then, of course, there are opportunities for you to roll up your sleeves, maybe get a little dirty, picking up litter, doing some trail maintenance. I know some of the groups are going to be doing some removal of invasive species. So there are all kinds of ways that you could get involved in stewardship. And we're very grateful to you, Allen, for sharing your knowledge and for putting the work into publishing this book so many more people can learn about it and do something about it. But go to pahealthylandsweek.org, find an event near you, and get out there and show you care. Thanks again for joining us for this virtual Lunch and Learn, and signing off for this Pennsylvania Healthy Lands Week special event.